Hi everyone, this is a short sort of feedback on the True Grit piece, but it's also much more generally a kind of advice as you are starting to really get to grips with the media piece critique and commentary. First of all, we have a divided class. It's normal. I'm playing devil's advocate there. I normally put that piece in. If we were in class, we would get probably a split class. It's one of the pieces that always gets half the class feeling elated and loving it, and the other half feeling horrified and hating it. People have a strong gut reaction to that piece, and that's fine. But it's a good opportunity to realize that the critique and the commentary is not a gut reaction. It's not an emotional commentary. You are putting your researcher hat on, and you're looking at it purely in terms of research design and approaches to research. Now, I grant you this is not a research piece, but it's the subtext is there that obviously if they've done this documentary because some of these headmasters are purporting that now this is almost a scientific sort of approach to and certainly research based approach to this notion of grit and resilience. Lots of problematic thing. I would say it's a typical example of a research design which is a bit wonky from the start because it really gets mixed up in its design. So to give a historical context, and this is probably why it's hard because some of you may not have that historical context. True Grit emerged from a very specific set of schools in the 70s and the 80s, mostly from what we call the urban education movement, which is really a euphemism to say inner city African American schools in the US that are socioeconomically deprived and really hammered by phenomena and variables around criminality, guns, possession, drug use, etc. So these schools, which are basically the problem in the States, is that after the white flight, these inner city schools are extremely underfunded because there's very little tax being paid in these inner cities because the white residents have left. So it's mostly just business who are not necessarily paying towards schools, etc. And the rest are pretty much working class districts where really housing is cheap and therefore a tax is not municipal taxes, etc., are not high, and therefore the schools are underfunded. And a lot of those are under attack in terms of threatened with closure if they don't, increase their performance in standardized testing, etc. So it's in that context that True Grit came about, and really what it represents is African American teachers within that context talking to African American students, and then realizing that really you're trying to motivate kids in an environment where really are not many winning opportunities, and realizing how difficult it is to motivate kids when there are really very few motivational sort of variables that would lead them to take this seriously and take school seriously, since there's lack of employment, etc. But looking at some of these students still succeeding and doing fairly well in sports, particularly in basketball and American football, and being able to push themselves and sometimes get scholarship and change their lives and leave the cities, etc. So the idea came about for these young African American teachers to think, well, why don't we adopt in the classroom some of the same approach that we adopt on the field, which is very much to say it's tough, everything is against you, but you want to win. If you want to win, you've got to beat the odds, you've got to make it. And actually, instead of approaching them in the classroom by saying everyone has equal opportunities, actually being much more realistic and straightforward and saying you don't have equal opportunities, everything is against you. But if you can transfer some of that spirit that you show on the field into the classroom, you may be able to achieve similar outcomes in terms of societal sort of promotion and growth and opportunities. And it worked fairly well. And there's a lot of research around the use of resilience and the use of True Grit in these environments, in that context, very sort of racially specific context. Again, not done by white teachers and principals, done by African American teachers with African American students. within the understanding of both that they're sort of marginalized and oppressed and they're a victim of these variables that try to keep them down. So with time, it has been appropriated, it's no other word, it's been appropriated by middle class schools and by white schools, to the point that it's stretched an environment where it actually makes no sense. You can't, the notion of grit is not just about resilience, it's about a social awareness of oppression and marginalization that you sort of get your students to realize, accept, and acknowledge and challenge despite this and try to change those power dynamics despite the odds. So then to position yourself in the middle class white environment and say, okay, we're going to do the same, is sort of absurd, because these are people who are not dealing with odds against them, and therefore you're transposing a concept that was created and conceptualized and used in a very specific sort of socioeconomic context, and then transposing it to an environment where it makes no sense. Now, the other part in there is where they're using, the marshmallow study. Be very careful of that as researchers, because this is a perfect example of a lot of quantitative work that was done in early what we call social psychology in the 60s to the beginning of the 80s, which were all catastrophic. So if ever you want to see the limitations of quantitative studies, you just have to look at that entire body of studies. And I will name a few. And when we look at ethics, you will see that every single consideration that we have in our ethics application comes from one of these early social psychology studies which did horrific things. So not only were they misleading, but they also literally created such horrific situation that they are now seen as an example of what to never do in research. But anyway, and marshmallow experience is not that grave. There's not really any sort of major concern there. But the biggest sort of pitfall is that it's a common trait of all these sort of early psychology experiments. They are quantitative and they look valid, but they have no meaning because they have been created in the lab. So you see kids being positioned in the lab where a lot of the variables are excluded artificially. The focus is only on one variable, ignoring the rest. So you have one control variable and you seem to be able to show something. But when you take these experiments and you bring them back into the real world, you realize that actually that's the whole inherent nature of the real world. We never really deal with one variable in an isolated way. So although you have all these quantitative results that seem to show something, it actually shows nothing about the real world. So you're back in your classroom and that data actually is completely meaningless. So yes, you can put kids in front of a marshmallow, but you're not actually showing anything about what resilience actually means in the real world. I'll give you another example, and we'll come back to this. There's a fellow called Milgram. So there's about, as I said, about 12 of these studies, and they all knew each other, and they're all really connected, and they all really formed the beginning of what we call early social psychology. One of these fellows was called Milgram. This is post 1945. The Nuremberg trial have just taken place. So Nuremberg trials were the big trials where the Nazis were sort of trialed for the war atrocities. And a common defense at the Nuremberg trial was, I only did it because I was told to. I followed orders, right? So it was called the Nuremberg defense. And so Milgram was American and was fascinated by this notion that either just lying or is this something real? Is this a real phenomenon in social psychology? So he created this study, and I don't mind spending a bit of time explaining to you this because we will come back to it in ethics anyway. Created this study where he had groups of participants come forward. They were divided in two. One went into one room, the other went into the other room. It seemed random. In fact, this was a deceit because only half of the group were true participants from the general public. The other half were actors that were sort of pre-selected and knew what was going on. So here you have a candid half sample that is truly volunteering and has no idea what happens. The other half are actors hired for that purpose that are pretending to be participants randomly selected into the second group. And then in pairs, they go into two sides of the lab, and then the true volunteers are told that they are participating in a study on memory. and that the other volunteer, the other participant, has been placed in another part of the lab where they can hear them, but they can't see them. They have been attached to a mechanism that has electric probes, and they are going to be asked to repeat a sequence of words that's going to become increasingly complicated. And they are told that in order to study memory, those other participants are given an electric shock to sort of motivate them to really try their hardest in learning the sequence as they appear and repeating the sequence. There are many instances of the other participants the other volunteer having to repeat a sentence that they've heard. It gets increasingly complicated, and the shock becomes increasingly higher. So the truly candid, let's say, volunteers that don't know what's going on are sitting in front of a dial, which has about a range of about 12 different, range of sort of intensity of voltage. And there's a signage above it that says, from weak, it goes all the way to death or possible death at the end. And there's a guy in a white coat that says, right, so let's go to the next spread and the next sort of cue. And they give the verbal cue. They wait for the actor on the other side to repeat. He gets it wrong. They give them a shock. And then as the person gets it more and more wrong, they're told, shock them again, shock them again, shock them again, shock them again. And what Milgram showed is that, again, in these isolated lab conditions, 66% of people would kill the participant in the other room. Now, he has done these studies with men, with female. He's done in Australia, in England, in the US, and he gets just about the same, sort of rating, which led, again, using quantitative data, led someone like Milgram to claim then that 66% of us are basically potential murderers because we will follow authority and do it if we are asked to. You see how this becomes completely absurd because this is quantitative data, yes, but obtained in isolated lab conditions where all other variables are being eliminated and you only look at the control variables. Here, control variables, being the authority figure telling you something, etc. In the real world, you are never just faced with one single variable. Yes, there may be someone giving you an order, but there are peers there who will also challenge. There are other leaders who will also challenge. We are in an environment where it's very rare that in fact you depend solely on another person telling you to do something that could possibly harm someone else. So it shows you the absurdity of some of these data. And so as a researcher critiquing this piece, there's all your alarm bells should go up when you look at something, and when a study from the 60s to the 80s in early social psychology is cited, because it is evidence, but it's one evidence of thousands that prove sometimes the very contrary, right? So if you look at the work of there's a guy at Dalhousie, his name will come back to me, who runs the Canadian Center on Resilience, and Ungar, I think it's Michael Ungar, who's really the big authority on resilience. So he's a psychologist as well, but if you want to look at some of the stuff that his research center does, as a field, psychology around resilience has now become very, very subtle and uses ecological theory to understand the complexity of what resilience might mean or how it represents itself. And they see it really as a complex construct that has less to do with your traits or your biological trait or your inherent wiring, and has more to do with the modeling that happens around you. Again, it's the nature versus nurture, and these days a lot of people now think resilience is something that, if it does exist, is developed and grown because of everything that surrounds you in terms of interaction, social capital, etc. And it's very little to do with your inherent biological wiring. So really, it would go in and right against a lot of what you see in that video. But really what should shock you the most is, again, this notion of transferring concepts and design ideas and research design ideas that come from a very specific context of particularly critical race theory. And you must have, I know you haven't done theory yet, but you must have heard about critical race theory because it's the big hot topic in the US at the moment, with entire states saying they refuse to teach it in school. So this is where it comes from. It's a topic of critical race theory, grounded in social justice and reflection around social justice and race, that then you transfer in an environment where you make abstraction of race, abstraction of social and economic inequalities, and then you rely on some sort of outdated early psychology experiment to try and sort of articulate the foundation of what you're trying to show there, all your alarm bells should be going off, right? And whether you believe in a lot of the arguments which are being made there or not, that's a different matter. But in terms of research, it's wonky, it's hugely problematic. Every single hair on your body should be rising. It should give you ghost pimple because it's so bad. Anyway, if you thought you loved it, that's fine. If you love the some of the arguments made, but as a researcher, you cannot really do anything but critique it fundamentally from beginning to end. If you got it wrong, it's not a problem. This is a learning curve. This is why you're on a course, because you can develop that sense and get used to having that sort of researcher hat on. But it's a good lesson for the rest of the semester as you're trying to reach your 3 pieces that you will get assessed, that your reaction and your commentary and your critique should not be a gut feeling. It should not be an emotional response. It's not about whether you like it or you agree with it. It's about looking at it from the critical eye of a researcher. Okay, and then you're going to develop that critical eye as a researcher, and you're going to be getting more sensitivity and more awareness around that role, the design, the factors you should be looking at. So it's kind of fun, and don't worry, I put that piece in there because you get the same kind of reaction every time, and I think it's really great in tripping you almost, right? And for you to realize, okay, this isn't what we need. So it's a sort of a reflective exercise around looking ahead at always centering your commentary and your critique within this course on really looking on, again, who's the stakeholder, who is taking, being again, the same question you're asking yourself for your own research. Who's the reader or potential reader? Who's the stakeholder that's going to be interviewed and offer the data? What is the reason, the research question, the design? What's the orientation of the research design? What are they trying to do with this? And then to critique all this and see if really you cannot see a more effective way of doing it. And sometimes it's going to be great, but sometimes it's going to be problematic. And you're going to realize there's probably something much more appealing that presents itself within the same topic area in terms of what you could do instead if you reflect on this. I will see you at the next Collaborate session.